Hello there, my sleepy hearts. Tonight, we explore 3 hours of Midnight Sun theories through the Twilight saga, diving deep into Edward Cullen's perspective, the mysteries his telepathic gift reveals, and the unanswered questions that linger in the shadows of his century-long existence. Edward's story is one of hidden depths. A mind reader who cannot escape his own thoughts, who sees into every soul except the one he loves most, who carries secrets that even Midnight Sun left tantalizingly unresolved. So, there's something I'd love to ask of you folks. Hope you guys can subscribe and help me reach my goal of 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Piecing together these theories is a labor of love that takes immense time and dedication. And your support means more than you know. Thank you. As you settle in, I'm curious where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You can tell me in the comments. Alright, let's get cozy now. Close your eyes, breathe in very slowly, and let the mysteries of Edward's Midnight Sun carry you gently into rest. Edward Anthony Mason was born June 20th, 1901 in Chicago, Illinois, to Edward Mason Sr. and Elizabeth Mason. His human life spanning 17 years through childhood and adolescence in early 20th century America, where Victorian values were giving way to modern sensibilities and where the world was transforming through industrialization and through social changes that his upper middle class family both participated in and resisted according to their particular positions in Chicago society, that valued respectability and valued propriety above almost all other considerations. His father worked in law or in business, whose specific nature remains mysterious in canon. The family's comfortable financial situation suggesting a successful professional career that provided large house and provided servants and provided lifestyle that included piano lessons for young Edward and included education at private institutions and included social standing that made Masons respectable members of Chicago's professional class during decades when such distinctions mattered enormously. Elizabeth Mason's character emerges through limited canon references as strong-willed woman, whose intelligence and whose determination manifested in her fierce protection of her only son, and manifested in her final wishes to Carlisle Cullen that would determine Edward's fate, her personality suggesting someone who was not typical docile Victorian wife, but was rather woman, whose force of will and whose maternal devotion exceeded conventional boundaries that society placed on female behavior during era when women's strength was supposed to manifest quietly rather than forcefully. The theory emerges that Elizabeth Mason possessed unusual perceptiveness or possessed unusual strength of character that allowed her to recognize something supernatural in Carlyle despite his careful human facade. Her dying request that he save Edward by any means necessary, suggesting she somehow understood that Carlyle possessed capabilities beyond normal medical intervention, and suggesting she was willing to accept whatever transformation that intervention might require if it meant her son's survival. Edward's human personality before transformation remains largely mysterious beyond canon hints that he was dutiful son and was talented pianist and was intelligent young man whose rebellion against authority had not yet manifested when his human life ended at 17. The Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 cutting short whatever development his personality might have undergone during transition from adolescence into adulthood that normal human life would have provided. The theory persists that Edward's human personality was perhaps more conventional and perhaps more obedient to social expectations than his vampire personality would suggest. His century of immortality and his telepathic gift fundamentally altering his worldview and fundamentally altering his relationship to human social structures in ways that make reconstructing his original human character almost impossible. When the Edward who exists in Midnight Sun has been shaped by supernatural existence and shaped by experiences that transcend anything his human self could have imagined. The Spanish influenza pandemic swept through Chicago in autumn of 1918 with devastating efficiency that overwhelmed hospitals and overwhelmed morgues and overwhelmed the city's capacity to respond to crisis that was killing thousands within weeks. The virus being particularly lethal to young, healthy adults whose robust immune systems created cytokine storms that drowned victims in fluid accumulating in their lungs, while their bodies fought infection too aggressively for their own survival. Edward Mason Sr. succumbed first to the illness, his death leaving Elizabeth and Edward alone in a house that had been filled with servants and filled with activity. But that became quarantine space where mother and son battled illness together. While outside their windows, the city struggled with pandemic that was destroying families and destroying communities with impartial cruelty that made no distinction between wealthy and poor when virus spread through all levels of society. Carlyle Cullen's presence at the hospital, where Elizabeth and Edward were dying, represents one of canon's enduring mysteries regarding exactly how and exactly when Carlyle first encountered the Mason family. His position as doctor treating influenza patients, providing access to thousands of dying people, among whom Edward should not have been particularly notable except for his mother's specific appeal, and except for whatever quality Carlyle perceived in the dying 17-year-old that made him worth saving through transformation that Carlyle had performed only once before when creating Esme. The theory emerges that Elizabeth Mason somehow recognized Carlyle's supernatural nature through fever-induced delirium or through mother's intuition that transcended rational assessment. Her final words to Carlyle containing requests that no normal doctor could fulfill and containing implications that she understood transformation was possible, even if she could not have understood vampire nature specifically, or could not have understood what her son would become through Carlyle's intervention. Elizabeth's dying plea that Carlyle do what others cannot do and save her son suggests knowledge, or suggests desperate hope that transcended conventional medical possibilities her phrasing being ambiguous enough that Carlyle could interpret as permission for transformation, or could interpret as simple maternal desperation for any intervention regardless of its nature. The theory persists that Elizabeth saw something in Carlyle's eyes, or saw something in his presence that marked him as different from other doctors, her request being specifically directed to him, rather than being general plea to any available medical staff, suggesting recognition of his unique capabilities, even if that recognition operated on instinctive level, rather than on intellectual understanding of what Carlyle actually was. Carlyle's decision to transform Edward rather than allowing him to die with his mother represents choice that had profound implications, and represents choice whose specific motivations remain somewhat mysterious when Carlyle's usual practice was avoiding transformation, except under extraordinary circumstances where dying person specifically desired immortality and specifically understood what transformation would entail. Edward was unconscious and dying and unable to consent to his transformation. Carlyle's decision to transform him anyway, being based partly on Elizabeth's request and partly on Carlyle's own assessment that Edward deserved chance at survival, and partly on Carlyle's loneliness and his desire for companionship in immortal existence that had been solitary for centuries before he created Edward as son and as companion, who might share his values and might share his commitment to vegetarian lifestyle. The transformation itself occurred in Carlyle's home rather than in hospital, where Edward's death was expected and where his body was presumably removed under pretense of taking him to morgue. Carlyle's ability to extract dying patients without arousing suspicion, suggesting either his authority as doctor allowed such removal, or suggesting the chaos of pandemic made careful record keeping impossible. When so many were dying, that individual deaths received minimal attention from overwhelmed hospital staff. The theory emerges that Carlyle may have falsified death certificate, or may have simply allowed hospital staff to assume Edward had died like so many others. The anonymity of mass death during pandemic providing cover for Edward's disappearance, and providing explanation for his absence that his extended family or his acquaintances would accept without investigation. Edward's experience of transformation pain is never described in detail within canon. His own memories of those 3 days remaining private even within his internal monologue in Midnight Sun. The omission suggesting either that transformation trauma was too horrific to revisit even in thought, or suggesting that memory of pain has faded across century of existence in ways that make accurate recall impossible. The theory persists that Edward's transformation may have been particularly agonizing or particularly difficult because he was dying from influenza when transformation began, his body being already compromised and already failing when venom entered his system and began its work of rewriting his biology from dying human into immortal vampire whose crystalline structure would replace diseased tissue and whose supernatural physiology would eliminate illness that had been killing him. His awakening as vampire occurred with Carlyle present to explain what had happened and to explain what Edward had become, and to begin teaching him about vampire nature and about vegetarian alternative to traditional vampire diet that Carlyle practiced. Edward's first moments of consciousness as vampire, including immediate realization of sensory enhancement and immediate realization of physical changes that transformation had created. The discovery of his telepathic gift manifested immediately upon awakening, when Edward heard Carlyle's thoughts with crystalline clarity, the mental voice being distinct from spoken voice and being complete access to consciousness that contained not just surface thoughts, but contained memories and contained emotions and contained everything that constituted Carlyle's mental existence in that moment. The theory emerges that Edward's telepathy manifesting immediately, rather than developing gradually, suggests his gift was somehow connected to his human personality, or somehow connected to his human consciousness in ways that transformation enhanced, rather than creating entirely new capability. The possibility existing that Edward possessed some degree of empathic sensitivity, or possessed some degree of psychological perceptiveness as human, that vampire transformation amplified into full telepathic access to others' minds. Carlyle's shock at discovering Edward's gift created immediate understanding that his new companion possessed capability that exceeded normal vampire parameters and possessed capability that would fundamentally affect Edward's development and would fundamentally affect his experience of vampire existence in ways that Carlyle could not fully predict despite his centuries of experience with vampire nature. Edward's newborn year should have been a period of overwhelming thirst and overwhelming physical urges that characterize first 12 months after transformation, when vampire strength peaks temporarily and when control is minimal even among those attempting vegetarian lifestyle. But his telepathy may have provided advantage that other newborns lacked by allowing him to hear Carlyle's thoughts about control and allowing him to hear Carlyle's strategies for resisting human blood in ways that made learning discipline faster than it would have been through observation and instruction alone. The theory persists that Edward's telepathy also made his newborn year more difficult in other ways by forcing him to hear thoughts of every human whose proximity triggered his thirst, the knowledge of their consciousness and the knowledge of their inner lives, potentially making resistance harder when prey was revealed as thinking, feeling person, rather than being anonymous source of blood. His relationship with Carlyle during these early years developed into father-son dynamic that transcended normal vampire creator-creation relationship. Carlyle's genuine paternal affection and Carlyle's commitment to teaching Edward everything about vampire existence, creating bond that Edward had not expected, and creating bond that replaced his human family, while never quite erasing memories of Elizabeth and Edward Sr., whose deaths had preceded his transformation by days or weeks. The theory emerges that Edward's attachment to Carlyle was intensified by his telepathic access to Carlyle's genuine goodness and genuine compassion. His ability to verify that Carlyle's stated values matched his internal thoughts, creating trust that normal relationships could never achieve, when Edward would always know whether someone was lying or whether someone's presented persona matched their actual consciousness. The 1920s brought gradual adjustment to vampire existence and brought gradual mastery of his capabilities. Edward's decade of learning occurring during Roaring Twenties, when American culture was transforming through jazz and through prohibition and through social revolution that made Victorian values seem increasingly outdated, even as Edward clung to moral framework from his human era. His development of musical talent that had begun during his human childhood accelerated through vampire capability and through immortal time, his piano playing becoming extraordinary through combination of enhanced physical coordination and enhanced sensory perception that allowed him to hear music with clarity and with nuance that human hearing could never achieve. The theory persists about Edward's activities during 1920s when he was young vampire learning his capabilities while living in era of tremendous social change. His presence in Chicago or his presence elsewhere with Carlyle remaining ambiguous in canon when specific locations and specific activities during this decade are never detailed. The possibility exists that Edward and Carlyle moved frequently during these years to avoid arousing suspicion about their unchanging appearance, their established pattern of staying in location for several years before moving to new community and establishing new identities, possibly beginning during this period when Edward was learning to pass as human and learning to maintain facade that would allow them to exist among humans without detection. His discovery of other vampires beyond Carlyle and his understanding of wider vampire civilization occurred gradually through encounters with nomads and through Carlyle's explanations about Volturi and about vampire laws and about supernatural world that Edward had entered through transformation. His telepathy providing immediate verification of information, an immediate understanding of other vampires' natures when their thoughts revealed their values and revealed their dietary choices and revealed whether they were threats or potential allies. The 1930s brought further development and brought further integration into his vampire identity. Edward's transformation from newborn to mature vampire occurring across decade when his control improved and when his understanding of his own nature deepened through experience and through Carlyle's continued guidance that shaped Edward's moral framework and shaped his commitment to preserving human life, even while existing as predator whose nature designed him for human consumption. Edward's rebellion against Carlyle's vegetarian philosophy began in 1927 when he was approximately 9 years into his vampire existence. His departure from Carlyle occurring at a moment when his control was excellent and when his integration into their shared lifestyle seemed complete. The timing suggesting that rebellion was not born from newborn bloodlust or born from inability to maintain discipline, but was rather born from philosophical disagreement and born from Edward's growing certainty that Carlyle's approach to vampire nature was unnecessarily restrictive, when alternative interpretations of morality might justify different choices about whose blood deserved protection and whose blood might be acceptably consumed. The specific trigger for his departure remains mysterious in canon, when Edward's internal monologue in Midnight Sun references this period only obliquely. His reluctance to examine his rebellion years in detail, suggesting shame or suggesting guilt, that makes detailed recollection painful even after centuries has passed, since his return to Carlyle's household and to vegetarian lifestyle. The theory emerges that Edward's telepathy contributed significantly to his decision to rebel by exposing him constantly to darkest human thoughts and to most vicious human impulses. His access to consciousness revealing murderers and revealing rapists and revealing predators whose internal monologues contained plans for violence and contained complete absence of remorse or contained active enjoyment of others' suffering. His decade of hearing such thoughts while maintaining strict vegetarian diet that treated all humans as equally deserving of protection, regardless of their character or their intentions, created philosophical tension where Edward began questioning whether truly evil humans deserve same consideration as innocent humans. His telepathy providing evidence that some humans were themselves predators, whose elimination might constitute justice, rather than constituting murder. His departure from Carlisle occurred without dramatic confrontation, or occurred without explicit explanation beyond Edward's statement that he needed to experience vampire existence independently from Carlisle's guidance. His framing of rebellion as temporary exploration rather than as permanent rejection, allowing both of them to maintain hope of eventual reunion, while acknowledging that Edward needed freedom to make his own choices about how to exist as vampire. Carlisle's response to Edward's departure demonstrated his fundamental respect for Edward's autonomy and demonstrated his trust that Edward's essential goodness would eventually lead him back to vegetarian lifestyle. His willingness to allow Edward to leave without attempting to prevent rebellion or without attempting to track him, showing confidence in foundation that their decade together had created. Edward's methodology during rebellion years involved using his telepathy to identify humans whose thoughts revealed them as murderers or revealed them as planning murders. His selection criteria being based entirely on mental evidence rather than on investigation of actual crimes or on legal confirmation of guilt. The theory persists that Edward positioned himself as judge and jury and executioner, whose telepathic evidence allowed him to condemn and consume those he deemed deserving of death. His victims including murderers who'd escaped legal justice, and including those planning murders who had not yet committed crimes, but whose intentions Edward read as clearly as if they had already acted on violent impulses occupying their consciousness. His hunting grounds during these 4 years from 1927 through 1931 remain geographically ambiguous in canon. The theory suggesting he travelled extensively through American cities where population density provided sufficient number of potential victims whose criminal thoughts would eventually reveal themselves to his telepathic scanning. His presence in Chicago seems unlikely, given that returning to city of his human life would create painful memories and would risk encounter with any surviving extended family members who might somehow recognize him, despite his supposed death during influenza epidemic. His avoidance of familiar locations suggesting he traveled to cities where anonymity was guaranteed and where his hunting could occur without personal connection to location, complicating his already complex moral calculations. The specific number of victims Edward consumed during rebellion remains unknown in canon, his references to this period being vague about precise body count and being vague about frequency of his feeding, the ambiguity suggesting either that he prefers not to calculate exact number or suggesting that memory has blurred details in ways that make accurate accounting impossible. The theory emerges that Edward fed more frequently during rebellion than he feeds as vegetarian, when animal blood requires more frequent consumption than human blood would require to maintain same level of satiation. His hunting of criminals possibly occurring weekly or possibly occurring monthly, depending on his thirst level and depending on how quickly he could locate suitable victims whose thoughts revealed guilt justifying their deaths. His justification system relied entirely on telepathic evidence without external verification or without consideration that thoughts alone might not constitute sufficient proof of guilt. His certainty that he could accurately read intentions and accurately assess character-creating situation where his judgment was absolute and was final without appeal or without possibility of mistake. The theory persists that Edward's confidence in his telepathy was perhaps misplaced during these years when grief and when anger and when philosophical confusion might have affected his interpretation of thoughts he was reading, his selection of victims possibly being less rigorous than he remembers, or less justified than his retrospective assessment suggests, where memory tends to smooth uncomfortable details and tends to create coherent narrative from chaotic experience. The psychological toll of being executioner manifested gradually across 4 years of rebellion. Edward's initial certainty about righteousness of his actions, slowly eroding through accumulated experience of entering minds of those he killed, and through accumulated weight of deaths that his hands had caused regardless of victims' guilt. His telepathy meant he experienced his victims' final thoughts, and experienced their terror, and experienced their recognition of death approaching. The intimate knowledge of their consciousness during their final moments, creating psychological burden that feeding on animals would never create when animal consciousness was simpler and was less relatable than human thoughts, that Edward understood completely through his own human origins and through his century of hearing human mental voices. The theory emerges about Edward's lowest moral point during rebellion years when his selection criteria may have loosened, or when his definition of deserving death may have expanded to include lesser crimes or lesser intentions than murder, his thirst potentially overriding his standards during moments when convenient victim presented themselves with thoughts that Edward could interpret as sufficiently criminal to justify feeding, even if objective assessment would not support his rationalization. The possibility exists that Edward killed someone whose guilt was ambiguous or whose criminal thoughts were fantasies rather than genuine intentions. His retrospective shame about rebellion period potentially including specific incidents that violated even his relaxed moral framework during these years. His decision to return to Carlisle in 1931 came not from external pressure, or from being caught, or from being forced to abandon rebellion, but came from internal recognition that his justification system was failing, and that his psychological state was deteriorating through isolation and through guilt, accumulating despite his attempts to rationalize his choices. The theory suggests that specific incident or specific victim may have triggered his return when someone's final thoughts revealed information that challenged Edward's assumptions or revealed complexity that his binary guilty or innocent framework could not accommodate. The cognitive dissonance created by such encounter potentially breaking through his defenses and forcing him to acknowledge that his rebellion was causing him to become something he did not want to be. Carlyle's acceptance of Edward's return without recrimination and without demanding detailed confession demonstrated his understanding that Edward needed to make his own mistakes and needed to discover through experience rather than through instruction why vegetarian lifestyle was necessary for maintaining their humanity and for maintaining their souls if such things existed for vampires. The theory persists that Carlyle knew generally what Edward had been doing during rebellion years through hearing about unexplained deaths fitting pattern of Edward's likely activity. His choice not to confront Edward about specifics representing respect for Edward's privacy and representing trust that Edward's conscience would be sufficient punishment for whatever actions he had taken during his time away. Edward's guilt after returning manifested as strengthened commitment to vegetarian lifestyle and manifested as determination never to feed on humans again, regardless of their character or their crimes. His experience during rebellion, having taught him that being judge of others was burden too heavy for any individual consciousness to bear, and was responsibility that required humility about limits of his knowledge, despite his telepathic access to thoughts. His shame about rebellion period persisted across subsequent decades, his references to this time being brief and being reluctant even in his own internal monologue, suggesting that examining these years too closely threatens his carefully maintained self-image and threatens his hard-won equilibrium that allows him to function within Cullen family without constant self-recrimination about his nature. The theory emerges that Edward never rebelled again, despite having numerous opportunities, and despite having ongoing exposure to criminal thoughts, because his rebellion experience taught him that consuming human blood, regardless of justification, created psychological damage and created moral slippage that endangered his fundamental values and endangered his relationship with Carlyle, whose approval and whose respect Edward valued more highly than temporary satisfaction of feeding on humans, whose thoughts reveal them as deserving death. His commitment to vegetarian lifestyle after 1931 was absolute and was unshakable even during moments when his control was tested. His memory of rebellion's psychological cost, providing motivation for restraint, that abstract moral philosophy alone could never have supplied with equivalent strength. Edward's telepathic gift operates through mechanisms that remain somewhat mysterious, even within Canon's detailed exploration of supernatural abilities. His access to others' thoughts functioning automatically and constantly without conscious activation, required to trigger reception of mental voices that surround him whenever other minds exist within his range. The mechanics of his gift suggest something resembling radio reception, where his consciousness acts as receiver tuned to frequency of thought itself, his vampire brain processing mental signals that emanate from nearby consciousness in ways that human neurology could never detect or could never interpret, even if such signals exist within normal physical reality, rather than existing within purely supernatural dimension that vampire gifts occupy. His range varies considerably depending on circumstances and depending on his familiarity with specific mental voices he is tracking. His ability to hear Bella's truck approaching from several miles away, when he knows her engine's sound contrasting with his inability to hear unfamiliar minds at equivalent distances when lack of recognition requires closer proximity for initial detection. The theory emerges that Edward's range extends further when he is actively searching for specific consciousness he knows well, versus when he is passively receiving whatever thoughts happen to be broadcasting within his sphere of awareness. His focused attention allowing him to reach beyond his normal range through combination of concentration and familiarity with mental voice he seeks. The maximum range of Edward's gift remains ambiguous in canon, when specific distances are rarely quantified, and when his hearing of thoughts is described in relative terms suggesting miles rather than exact measurements. The theory suggesting his range might extend 5 to 10 miles under optimal conditions when he is focusing on known consciousness and when environmental factors do not interfere with reception. His ability to hear Alice's visions from significant distances and his ability to track Bella's location through hearing thoughts of those near her suggests his range is substantial enough to monitor entire town or entire region when actively scanning for specific information, rather than passively receiving ambient mental noise that characterizes his normal experience of telepathic gift. The clarity and volume of thoughts Edward hears varies based on multiple factors, including distance, and including strength of thinker's mental voice, and including whether thoughts are surface level or are buried beneath other cognitive activity. Some minds broadcasting loudly and clearly, while other minds produce quieter signals that require closer proximity or require greater concentration to interpret accurately. The theory persists that emotional intensity amplifies thought clarity when strong feelings make mental voices louder and make intentions more obvious. Edward's ability to hear panicked thoughts or angry thoughts from greater distances than he can hear calm, rational thoughts, suggesting that emotion serves as amplification mechanism for telepathic signals that his gift receives and processes. His perception of thoughts comes as mental voices that differ from spoken voices in tone and in quality. The internal monologue of consciousness, having distinct characteristics that identify individual minds as clearly as physical voices identify individual speakers, when each person's thought patterns and each person's mental vocabulary create unique signature that Edward recognizes instantly once familiar with particular consciousness. The distinction between surface thoughts that occupy immediate awareness and deeper thoughts that lurk beneath conscious attention remains somewhat unclear, his access seemingly limited to whatever occupies active consciousness, rather than including buried memories or suppressed desires, unless those elements surface into active thought during moments when Edward is listening. Canon provides limited information about whose thoughts Edward finds most difficult to hear beyond Bella's complete silence. The theory suggesting that minds occupied with complex abstract reasoning or minds occupied with intense focus on non-verbal tasks might produce less clear signals than minds engaged in verbal internal monologue that translates more directly into telepathic reception. Carlyle's thoughts might be particularly complex given his centuries of accumulated knowledge and his tendency toward philosophical contemplation, creating layered consciousness that Edward must work harder to interpret. While Emmett's thoughts might be simpler and clearer, given his straightforward nature and his tendency toward concrete rather than abstract thinking that produces mental voice with less ambiguity and less nuance to navigate when Edward focuses on his brother's consciousness. The question of whether Edward hears thoughts in languages he does not speak remains unresolved in canon. The theory dividing between possibility that thoughts translate automatically into language Edward understands versus possibility that foreign language thoughts remain incomprehensible, requiring him to learn languages to fully access minds of non-English speakers. His century of existence and his extensive education suggest he speaks multiple languages fluently. His time in various locations and his interactions with vampires from different cultures, providing motivation and opportunity to learn languages that would expand his telepathic access beyond English-speaking minds, whose thoughts would be immediately comprehensible, while foreign language thoughts would remain mysterious if translation does not occur automatically through supernatural gift. The babble of multiple minds in crowded locations creates cacophony, that Edward must filter constantly to maintain sanity and maintain focus. His description of cafeteria noise and his description of crowded hallways, suggesting that dozens or hundreds of simultaneous mental voices create overwhelming sensory experience, comparable to standing in a room where everyone is shouting different conversations simultaneously without pause or without consideration for listeners' capacity to process information. His ability to filter this noise and focus on specific minds represents learned skill developed across centuries of practice. His capacity to tune out irrelevant thoughts while tracking relevant consciousness, demonstrating remarkable mental discipline that newborn Edward presumably lacked when first experiencing telepathic gift immediately after transformation, brought awareness of others' minds flooding into his consciousness without preparation or without training in how to manage constant invasion of mental voices. The theory emerges about whether Edward can choose not to hear thoughts, or whether his gift operates continuously without off switch that would allow him to experience silence and experience privacy from others' consciousness. His descriptions of constant mental noise suggesting involuntary reception that he can filter but cannot completely prevent when conscious minds exist within range of his telepathic awareness. The possibility exists that sleep or unconsciousness might provide relief from telepathic reception, except vampires do not sleep and do not lose consciousness, leaving Edward without respite from mental voices beyond moments when he isolates himself completely from other consciousness through retreating to wilderness or through other methods of achieving solitude that allows genuine mental quiet unavailable in proximity to thinking beings. His most significant limitation manifests in Bella's complete silence, her immunity to his telepathy creating void in his awareness where her consciousness should broadcast, but produces nothing that his gift can detect or can interpret. The theory persists that Bella's mind is not actually silent, but rather is shielded by defensive gift that blocks telepathic intrusion, her shield operating unconsciously during human life, before transformation enhances it into projectable protection that she can extend to cover others whose minds would otherwise be vulnerable to mental attacks or vulnerable to mental reading. The question of whether other shield minds exist throughout history remains unanswered. Edward's surprise at Bella's immunity suggesting she is first consciousness he's encountered across his century of existence, that his telepathy cannot penetrate despite his attempts to hear her thoughts and despite his frustration at void where her mental voice should exist. The relationship between mental gifts across vampire civilization suggests common underlying mechanism with individual variations in expression. Edward's telepathy sharing conceptual space with Aro's touch-based mind reading and sharing conceptual space with Jane's pain illusions, and sharing conceptual space with Alec's sensory deprivation, despite different specific manifestations of mental capabilities. The theory emerges that mental gifts access consciousness through supernatural means that bypass physical brain structures, the abilities working directly on consciousness itself, rather than working through neural pathways that physical damage could disrupt, or that physical limitations could constrain. When vampire gifts transcend biological mechanisms and operate through purely supernatural principles, the question of whether Edward's telepathy could evolve or expand over time remains speculative. Vampire gifts generally being fixed at transformation and remaining stable across centuries rather than developing new capabilities or expanding existing range through practice or through experience that might strengthen gift beyond its initial parameters. The theory persists that Edward's control and filtering abilities have improved dramatically since transformation, while fundamental nature of his gift remains unchanged. His capacity to manage information and his capacity to focus attention representing learned skills rather than representing evolution of gift itself, whose basic function of receiving thoughts has been constant since his awakening as vampire in 1918. The ethical implications of Edward's constant invasion of privacy create moral complications that he acknowledges but cannot resolve when his gift operates involuntarily and when avoiding others' thoughts would require complete isolation from all consciousness, including his family, whose thoughts he hears constantly, despite loving them and despite respecting their right to mental privacy that his telepathy violates continuously. His century of hearing unfiltered thoughts has given him comprehensive understanding of human nature's darkness and human nature's complexity. His knowledge of secret thoughts and secret desires that people never speak aloud, creating cynicism about human goodness and creating difficultly trusting surface presentations when he knows how drastically they can differ from actual consciousness that his telepathy reveals without filter or without the social editing that characterizes normal human interaction. The specific impact of telepathy on Edward's personality development cannot be overstated when his entire world view has been shaped by access to consciousness that normal individuals never experience. His understanding of motivation and his understanding of deception and his understanding of self-deception coming from direct observation rather than from inference or from speculation that characterizes normal social intelligence. His isolation and his difficulty forming romantic connections before Bella stem directly from his telepathic knowledge. Destroying mystery and destroying possibility of gradual discovery that normal relationships depend upon. Every potential partner becoming completely known. Before relationship begins in ways that eliminate excitement and eliminate hope that deeper acquaintance might reveal hidden compatibility when Edward already knows everything about potential partner's consciousness before first conversation occurs. The theory persists that Edward's telepathy has made him simultaneously more understanding and more judgmental of human nature. His access to thoughts revealing both the selfishness and the kindness that coexist in normal consciousness, creating complicated assessment when no one is purely good or purely evil, but everyone is a mixture of competing impulses and competing desires that their behavior only partially reflects. Edward's complete romantic history before Bella consists primarily of absence and consists primarily of loneliness that stretched across 8 decades following his return from rebellion. His century of existence including no serious romantic relationships and including no genuine romantic interest despite his physical appearance, suggesting he should have attracted attention and should have had opportunities for connection that his telepathy systematically destroyed before they could develop into anything approaching love. His isolation was not result of lack of opportunity or result of lack of potential partners presenting themselves across decades of vampire existence, but was rather result of his gift revealing every potential partner's complete consciousness in ways that eliminated mystery and eliminated possibility of gradual discovery that human relationships depend upon for development, from initial attraction into deeper emotional connection. The telepathy transformed every potential romantic encounter into exercise in disappointment, and into exercise in discovering incompatibilities, or discovering shallowness, or discovering aspects of consciousness that made continued interest impossible. His ability to hear unfiltered thoughts, meaning that surface charm or surface beauty, could not sustain his attention when underlying thoughts revealed pettiness or revealed selfishness or revealed any of countless minor flaws that normal courtship would reveal gradually, but that his gift revealed immediately and completely. His idealization of romance and his Victorian values regarding love created standards that no real consciousness could meet, when he could hear every uncharitable thought, and could hear every moment of superficiality, and could hear every instance of self-interest that characterized normal human and vampire consciousness. Canon provides almost no information about whether Edward experienced attraction to anyone before Bella, beyond his explicit statement that he had never found anyone whose mind interested him enough to pursue relationship. His century of observing couples and his century of watching romance develop between others, creating understanding of what love should involve, while his telepathy prevented him from experiencing equivalent connection. The theory emerges that Edward may have experienced fleeting attraction to various individuals across his decades of existence, his physical response to beauty, or his intellectual response to interesting conversation, creating momentary interest that his telepathy destroyed within minutes or within hours of encountering potential partner, whose thoughts reveal them as incompatible or reveal them as insufficient for meeting his idealized standards. Tanya Denali's pursuit of Edward across decades represents most documented near romance in his history, her beauty and her vampire nature, and her genuine affection for him, creating situations where external factors suggested compatibility, even though Edward's reception of her thoughts revealed fundamental mismatch between what she wanted and what he could offer. Her interest in him began shortly after Denalis and Cullen's established friendship. Her immediate attraction to Edward's appearance and to his gift and to his unusual nature among vampires, creating desire for romantic relationship that persisted despite his consistent polite rejection of her advances and despite his obvious lack of reciprocal interest in pursuing relationship beyond friendship. The theory emerges about what specifically made Tanya incompatible with Edward, when her surface characteristics suggested she should have appealed to someone seeking a vampire partner, her beauty rivaling Rosalie's, and her personality being generally kind, and her lifestyle being vegetarian, matching Cullen values in ways that made her theoretically suitable match. His telepathic access to her thoughts revealed that her interest in him was partly genuine attraction but was partly fascination with his gift, and was partly desire to possess unusual vampire whose telepathy and whose complexity made him interesting conquest rather than revealing depth of feeling that Edward's idolized romance required. Her thoughts lacked intellectual complexity or lacked emotional depth that would sustain his interest across immortal existence, her consciousness being pleasant, but being insufficient for vampire whose telepathy meant that surface compatibility could not compensate for underlying mismatch in values or in intellectual engagement. His rejection of Tanya was gentle and was consistent across decades of her persistence. His refusal to reciprocate her interest being based not on any flaw that would justify complete dismissal, but rather on simple absence of romantic feeling that he could not force or could not manufacture, despite recognizing that Tanya represented logical choice and represented partner who would integrate seamlessly into his family structure. The theory persists that Edward's rejection of Tanya demonstrated his commitment to finding genuine love rather than settling for convenient relationship, his willingness to remain alone indefinitely rather than accepting insufficient connection, showing that his idealism about romance exceeded his desire to end his loneliness through compromising his standards. His idealization of human romance and his clinging to Victorian values regarding courtship and regarding love created framework that few potential partners could satisfy. His belief that true love involved complete emotional and intellectual compatibility and involved selfless devotion and involved eternal commitment, making normal relationships seem inadequate when they involved compromise or involved accepting partners' flaws or involved any of the ordinary accommodations that characterize functional long-term relationships. His century of reading minds had shown him that most romantic relationships involve significant self-interest and involved calculation and involved moments of doubt or moments of irritation that his idealized vision of love could not accommodate. The impact of being frozen physically at 17 while aging mentally across century created additional complication for Edward's romantic development. His appearance suggesting adolescent whose emotional maturity and whose life experience should match his physical age, while his actual consciousness contained century of memories and contained century of psychological development that made him fundamentally different from the 17-year-old body he inhabited. His potential partners either treated him as adolescent, whose physical appearance they responded to without recognizing depth of his actual experience, or recognized his true age and found his adolescent appearance disturbing when contemplating romantic relationship with someone who looked like teenager despite being a century old. His observations of Carlyle and Esme's relationship provided model for what vampire love could involve. Their genuine devotion and their deep compatibility and their mutual respect demonstrating that immortal romance was possible when partners truly suited each other. His watching of their relationship across decades created both hope that he might eventually find equivalent connection and created despair that their particular compatibility was rare enough that he might wait centuries or might wait forever without encountering similar match. The theory emerges that Carlyle and Esme's relationship raised Edward's standards even higher by demonstrating what was possible while simultaneously making ordinary relationships seem even more inadequate by comparison to their exceptional bond. Rosalie and Emmett's passionate relationship provided contrasting model that Edward found less appealing. Their physical intensity and their constant awareness of each other demonstrating type of love that was genuine, but that was based more on attraction and on compatible temperaments than on the intellectual and spiritual connection that Edward's idealism required. His observation of their relationship confirmed his belief that physical attraction alone was insufficient foundation for eternal commitment, their happiness together being real, but being based on factors that Edward's telepathy had taught him were unstable or were insufficient when he needed partner whose mind interested him as much as her appearance or her personality. Alice and Jasper's relationship demonstrated yet another model where supernatural connection through Alice's visions and through Jasper's empathy created bond that transcended normal courtship, their meeting being predestined by Alice's precognitive knowledge and their compatibility being enhanced through Jasper's ability to feel and influence her emotions. The theory persists that Edward envied their connection while recognizing that his own telepathy could never create equivalent bond when hearing thoughts was invasive rather than being connective. His gift revealing everything about potential partners in ways that destroyed mystery rather than creating supernatural understanding that enhanced relationship. The decades of watching his family members find love while he remained alone created loneliness that deepened across time, his isolation becoming more pronounced as each family member paired off, and as he became sole unpaired vampire in household where everyone else had found their eternal companion. His position as perpetual fifth wheel or seventh wheel in family gatherings created discomfort that he managed through focusing on music or through focusing on intellectual pursuits that provided distraction from his romantic failure, but that could not completely compensate for absence of intimate connection that he observed others experiencing. The theory emerges about whether Edward's loneliness peaked during particular decades, or whether it remained constant background condition of his existence. The possibility existing that certain periods were more difficult than others when watching new couples form, or when observing anniversary celebrations reminded him of his century without equivalent milestone to celebrate. His coping mechanisms included immersing himself in education, and immersing himself in music composition, and immersing himself in family relationships that provided love even if they could not provide romantic fulfillment that he craved. His various intellectual pursuits across the decades provided distraction and provided meaning that helped compensate for romantic absence. His completion of multiple medical degrees and multiple other advanced degrees creating sense of accomplishment and creating mental stimulation that immortal existence required to prevent boredom or prevent despair. His musical compositions expanded beyond simple performance into creation of original works that expressed emotions he could not otherwise articulate. His piano becoming outlet for loneliness and for longing that he could not share verbally with family members who pitied him, but who could not adequately understand his specific isolation. The question of whether Edward was actively searching for a romantic partner across his decades of loneliness, or whether he had resigned himself to eternal solitude remains ambiguous, his behavior suggesting mixture of hope and despair, where he remained open to possibility of finding love, while simultaneously believing that his telepathy made such discovery unlikely or impossible. His century of disappointment and his century of failed connections had taught him that his gift was barrier rather than advantage in romantic context. His ability to hear thoughts destroying relationships before they began through revealing incompatibilities that normal courtship would uncover gradually, if at all. The theory persists that Edward had largely given up on finding romantic love by the time he encountered Bella. His century of failure creating resignation that made him focus on family relationships and intellectual pursuits, rather than continuing to hope for romantic connection that seemed increasingly unlikely as decades passed, without anyone whose consciousness interested him enough to pursue. His surprise at his attraction to Bella and his shock at her silent mind suggested he had not been actively seeking partner when she appeared, her entrance into his life representing unexpected disruption to equilibrium he had achieved through accepting his permanent solitude. The biological impossibility of Edward fathering a child represents one of Midnight Sun's most perplexing mysteries, when vampire physiology as established in canon suggests that transformation freezes the body in crystalline state that eliminates biological processes including circulation and including cellular regeneration, and including any functions that require living tissue capable of change or capable of producing new cells. Vampire bodies are described as hard as stone and as cold as ice, and as fundamentally static in ways that should preclude any biological activity beyond the supernatural processes that maintain consciousness and maintain movement and maintain the venom-based system that sustains vampire existence without requiring food or requiring oxygen or requiring any of the inputs that human biology demands for survival. Carlyle's hypothesis about vampire fertility relies on theory that venom preserves everything present in human body at moment of transformation in state that is frozen but is somehow still functional under specific circumstances. His explanation suggesting that Edward's reproductive cells were preserved at transformation when he was 17 years old and at peak of male fertility, when sperm production would have been optimal and when reproductive capability would have been fully developed. The theory extends to suggest that venom acts as preservative that maintains viability of these cells across centuries of vampire existence despite absence of biological processes that normally sustain sperm production through continuous generation of new cells to replace those that degrade or that expire according to normal reproductive cycle. Edward's age at transformation becomes a crucial factor in this theoretical framework. When 17 represents age where male reproductive system has matured completely, but where body has not yet experienced any decline or any degradation that aging eventually brings to all biological systems, including reproductive capability. The theory emerges that vampires transform before puberty would lack viable reproductive cells because transformation occurred before their development, while vampires transform significantly after peak fertility might have degraded cells that transformation preserved in whatever state existed at moment of change, making Edward's specific age at transformation potentially optimal for retaining fertility that other male vampires might lack despite sharing his vampire nature. The concept of venom as both poison and preservative creates theoretical framework where vampire body is simultaneously dead in conventional biological sense, but is maintained in state that retains some capabilities that death would normally eliminate permanently. The venom replacing blood and replacing normal cellular function with supernatural equivalent that keeps consciousness intact and keeps body functional without requiring traditional biological processes. The theory suggests that venom circulates through vampire body in place of blood, its movement through crystalline vessels providing some mechanism for transportation and for maintaining connection between preserved organs, even though those organs no longer function in ways that living organs function in human bodies. The mechanics of how Edward could physically father child despite being vampire, whose body temperature is described as cold, and whose physical state is described as frozen, becomes subject of considerable theoretical speculation. The act of reproduction requiring biological responses that seem inconsistent with vampire physiology as described in canon. The theory emerges that vampire bodies retain some capacity for physical response to stimulation, even though mechanisms for such response differ fundamentally from human mechanisms. The possibility existing that venom-based system can create effects similar to human arousal through processes that do not depend on blood flow or do not depend on other circulatory functions that vampires lack. Male reproductive function requires less ongoing biological activity than female reproductive function, when males need only to release preserved genetic material, while females need to harbor foreign organism and need to provide sustained biological support across 9 months of gestation. The asymmetry potentially explaining why male vampires can father children, while female vampires cannot conceive or cannot sustain pregnancy. The theory suggests that female vampire bodies reject any foreign material, including fertilized eggs, that attempt to implant a uterine wall that has been transformed to crystalline state, incapable of providing environment necessary for embryonic development. The venom-based system treating pregnancy as invasion to be eliminated rather than as process to be supported. Stephen E. Meyer's explanation that vampire bodies treat pregnancy as damage to be repaired creates framework where female vampires' bodies would immediately destroy any developing embryo through vampire healing response that eliminates foreign tissue, while male vampires face no equivalent barrier because their contribution to reproduction involves release rather than involving sustained hosting of developing organism. The theory extends to suggest that venom in female vampire bodies would attack placental tissue and would attack embryonic cells as aggressively as vampire immune response attacks any injury or attacks any foreign material that attempts to integrate with crystalline structure that vampire transformation has created. The rarity of vampire-human hybrid children in documented history suggests that either male vampire fertility is extremely limited or suggests that specific conditions must align for conception to occur. The combination of factors required being sufficiently unusual that hybrid births represent exceptional events rather than representing common occurrence despite thousands of years of vampire existence and despite presumably numerous instances of male vampires engaging in sexual activity with human women. The theory emerges that emotional connection or emotional investment might play a role in vampire fertility, when Edward's deep love for Bella potentially activated reproductive capability that casual encounters would not trigger. The supernatural nature of vampires allowing for possibility that consciousness or that emotion affects biological function in ways that purely mechanical human reproduction does not experience. Joham's experiments creating multiple hybrid children through systematically impregnating human women and then abandoning them to die during birth provides evidence that vampire human reproduction is possible under certain conditions, his success rate remaining unknown when Canon mentions his hybrid daughters, but does not specify how many attempts failed or how many human women died without producing viable offspring. The theory suggests that Joham's deliberate methodology and his vampire nature, being ancient enough to have developed whatever capabilities enable reproduction, contributed to his success. His multiple hybrid children, demonstrating that Edward's fertility was not unique anomaly, but was rather manifestation of rare but reproducible vampire capability. The specific conditions required for hybrid conception remain mysterious, beyond basic requirement of male vampire and female human engaging in sexual activity. The theory suggesting that timing might matter when human female fertility varies across menstrual cycle, or suggesting that vampires' recent feeding might matter when venom concentration or venom potency potentially affects reproductive viability. Edward's honeymoon with Bella occurred shortly after their wedding, when both were presumably at emotional peak, and when Edward's control was being tested through physical intimacy that his century of abstinence made particularly intense. The combination of factors potentially creating optimal conditions for conception that might not occur under different emotional or physical circumstances. The question of whether arousal triggers semi-biological response in vampires despite their otherwise frozen physiology creates theoretical challenge when vampire bodies should not respond to stimulation in ways that require blood flow, or require tissue engorgement, or require any of the physical changes that characterize human sexual response. The theory emerges that venom-based system might create functional equivalent to human arousal through different mechanisms. The possibility existing that venom concentrates in specific areas, or that venom creates pressure, or that venom enables physical changes that approximate human responses without requiring actual biological processes that vampires lack. The viability of century-old sperm preserved in Edward's vampire body challenges biological understanding when human sperm outside body degrades rapidly, and when even frozen sperm has limited lifespan measured in years or decades rather than in centuries, his reproductive cells somehow remaining functional across 100 years, despite absence of cellular regeneration or cellular renewal that normally maintains sperm quality in living males. The theory suggests that venom acts as perfect preservative that prevents any degradation or any damage to genetic material. The supernatural properties of venom maintaining Edward's reproductive cells in state, identical to moments of transformation without any of the decay or damage that time normally inflicts on biological materials. The genetic viability of vampire sperm becomes additional theoretical concern when vampire transformation fundamentally alters biology in ways that might affect DNA, or might affect chromosomes, or might affect genetic information that sperm carries. The question arising whether Edward's sperm contains his human genetics, or contains modified genetics that reflect his vampire transformation. Esme's existence and a combination of vampire and human traits suggests that Edward's genetic contribution remained fundamentally human, despite his vampire state. His sperm apparently carrying unaltered human DNA that combined with Bella's human genetics to create hybrid, rather than creating creature that was predominantly vampire or predominantly human. The mechanism by which vampire venom remains separate from reproductive cells rather than transforming them into vampire venom, or rather than rendering them non-viable through contamination, represents another biological mystery. The theory suggesting that transformation somehow encapsulates or somehow protects reproductive cells from direct venom exposure while maintaining them in viable state. The alternative theory suggests that venom and reproductive cells can coexist because venom affects only certain cell types while leaving reproductive cells unchanged. The selective nature of transformation potentially explaining how Edward retains human sperm, despite his body being otherwise completely vampiric in composition. The question of whether other male vampires throughout history have unknowingly fathered hybrid children who died during birth along with their mothers remains unanswered. the possibility existing that Edward and Johann represent rare documented cases among potentially numerous undocumented instances where human women became pregnant by vampire partners and then died during delivery without anyone understanding supernatural cause of their deaths. The theory emerges that hybrid pregnancies might be consistently misattributed to normal pregnancy complications when medical understanding cannot account for vampire human reproduction, and when surviving family members would have no framework for interpreting deaths as resulting from supernatural rather than natural causes. The specific role that Bella's later transformation played in her survival after giving birth creates additional theoretical questions about whether human women can survive hybrid pregnancy without becoming vampires themselves. Johann's abandoned partners apparently dying during delivery, suggesting that transformation is necessary for maternal survival when hybrid infants' vampire characteristics make birth process lethal to human mother, whose body cannot withstand trauma that delivery inflicts. The theory suggests that Edward's immediate transformation of Bella after Renesmee's birth was not optional intervention, but was necessary rescue. When alternative was Bella's certain death from injuries that hybrid birth created through combination of internal damage and blood loss and physical trauma that human body could not survive without supernatural healing that vampire transformation provides. Edward's first sight of Bella Swan entering Forks High School cafeteria during her first week created immediate and extreme reaction that exceeded anything his century of vampire existence had prepared him for, his body responding to her scent with intensity that transformed controlled civilized vampire into creature barely restraining itself from massacre that would destroy his family's carefully maintained secret and would destroy decades of effort building their current life. The biology of La Tua Cantante, or singer blood, remains mysterious in vampire lore, when canon provides limited explanation for why specific human's blood appeals to specific vampire with intensity that exceeds normal human blood's appeal. The phenomenon being rare enough that most vampires never encounter their personal singer, and being powerful enough that encountering singer creates dangerous situation where even experienced vampires' control becomes uncertain. The theory emerges about why Bella's scent specifically appealed to Edward with such devastating intensity when thousands of humans he had encountered across centuries had smelled appealing, but none had created equivalent response. The possibility existing that singer phenomenon involves compatibility between vampires' venom and humans' blood chemistry, creating perfect storm of attraction that transcends normal predator-prey dynamics. His reaction to her scent was immediate and was total, his body going rigid and his mind focusing entirely on her blood and his control evaporating in seconds despite centuries of discipline and despite decades of vegetarian practice that should have made resistance possible even under extreme temptation. His eyes changing from gold to black between biology classes when he had seen her in cafeteria days earlier and when he sat beside her in their shared class demonstrates how rapidly thirst can overwhelm vampire whose normal control is excellent. The color shift indicating his extreme hunger and indicating his dangerous state when black eyes signal vampire who has gone too long without feeding and whose control is compromised through deprivation. The theory suggests that Edward had deliberately avoided hunting between seeing Bella in cafeteria and sitting beside her in biology class. his decision to test his control, or his belief that he could manage his reaction without preparation, representing dangerous miscalculation that nearly resulted in catastrophic loss of control. Edward's internal battle during that first biology class involved weighing his desire to kill everyone in classroom against his horror at contemplating such action. His telepathy providing awareness of all his classmates' thoughts and providing awareness of their humanity in ways that made imagining their deaths more difficult, even while his thirst made their death seem necessary to reach Bella, whose blood was calling to him with intensity that overrode every other consideration. The theory emerges about how close he actually came to attacking, when his descriptions of that hour suggest he was seconds away from losing control multiple times. His grip on the table edge, and his controlled breathing and his complete stillness representing maximum effort to prevent movement that would initiate massacre, he was constantly on verge of committing. His escape to Denali Coven in Alaska, immediately after that disastrous biology class, represented an attempt to remove himself permanently from temptation that Bella represented, his plan being to stay away indefinitely and allow his family to remain in Forks, while he isolated himself in location far enough from Bella that her scent could not reach him and could not continue testing his control. The Denali sisters' hospitality and Carlisle's long friendship with their coven made Alaska logical refuge. Their vegetarian lifestyle and their understanding of control struggles making them appropriate confidants for Edward's crisis, even though explaining situation without admitting how close he had come to killing entire classroom required careful editing of truth. The theory persists about what convinced Edward to return to Forks beyond Carlisle's persuasion that running away was cowardly and was unnecessary when Edward's control was normally excellent. The possibility existing that Edward's pride or Edward's determination not to be defeated by mere human girl motivated his return as much as any logical assessment of his actual capability to resist her blood. His week away from Forks allowed him to hunt extensively and allowed him to saturate his system with animal blood that might provide buffer against Bella's appeal. His return to school with golden eyes instead of black eyes, indicating he had fed heavily in preparation for renewed proximity to temptation that had nearly destroyed his control during their first encounter. The specific strategies Edward employed to build tolerance to Bella's scent remains somewhat mysterious when canon provides limited detail about his methodology beyond general indication that exposure combined with determination allowed gradual desensitization, the theory suggesting he practiced being near her in controlled circumstances where escape was possible if his control began failing. His hunting routine became more frequent and more intensive than his normal pattern. His constant satiation through excessive feeding provided maximum buffer against thirst that her scent triggered. His golden eyes remaining consistently light rather than darkening toward topaz that would indicate beginning of hunger that might compromise his resistance. The theory emerges about whether Edward practiced exposure to Bella's scent through methods beyond simply sitting beside her in biology class. The possibility existing that he positioned himself where he could smell her from distance before gradually decreasing that distance as his tolerance improved. His vampire speed and his vampire stealth, making such surveillance possible without her awareness or without observers noticing his attention focused on ordinary human girl. His watching her sleep began before they were romantically involved. and possibly began very early in their acquaintance, his justification being desire to understand her and desire to protect her from danger she might face. But underlying motivation likely included exposing himself to her scent in controlled situation where she was unconscious and where his control was tested without social pressures or without need to maintain conversation. The surveillance itself represents profound violation of privacy that Edward justified through various rationalizations, including his claim that he needed to understand her because her silent mind made her mystery he could not solve through his normal telepathic methods. His century of hearing everyone's thoughts making Bella's immunity fascinating enough to warrant extreme measures to compensate for information that her mind should have provided. The theory suggests Edward's stalking began within days of his return from Alaska, when his obsession with understanding her and his obsession with testing his control around her combined to motivate behavior that he recognized as wrong, but that he justified through claiming his intentions were protective rather than predatory. His presence in her bedroom watching her sleep occurred across multiple nights before she became aware of his surveillance, his ability to move silently, and his ability to remain completely still for hours, making detection impossible when Bella slept soundly, and when Charlie's own heavy sleep meant no one in Swan household noticed vampire spending nights in Bella's room. The theory emerges about when exactly this watching began, the timeline suggesting possibly weeks rather than days separated his return to Forks from his first entry into her bedroom, his gradual escalation from simply being near her at school to actively invading her private space representing progression that he later struggled to justify even to himself when Bella's acceptance of his behavior did not negate its fundamental wrongness. Edward's Victorian reasoning that his surveillance was chivalrous protection rather than stalking demonstrates how his outdated values and his century of isolation from normal human social development created blind spots in his ethical reasoning. His belief that he knew better than Bella what was good for her, and his belief that his intentions justified his methods, allowing him to rationalize behavior that contemporary standards would immediately identify as unacceptable, regardless of supernatural justification. The theory persists that Edward's telepathy had trained him to believe that privacy was a negotiable concept when he violated everyone's mental privacy constantly through his gift. His extension of that violation into physical surveillance of Bella, seeming like logical progression rather than representing qualitative escalation from involuntary telepathy to deliberate stalking. The Port Angeles incident, where Edward rescued Bella from potential attackers, demonstrates either remarkable coincidence or demonstrates that Edward's surveillance extended beyond her bedroom into tracking her movements throughout her daily activities, his presence in Port Angeles at exact moment when she needed rescue, seeming too perfectly timed to be accidental encounter. The theory divides between possibility that Edward was following her constantly and possibility that his telepathy alerted him to danger through hearing thoughts of her attackers from distance, his range being sufficient to monitor thoughts across miles when actively searching for specific consciousness that he knew well. Bella's mental silence making tracking her directly impossible, but tracking thoughts about her being viable alternative. His fury during rescue exceeded what situation warranted, unless his anger was directed not at Bella's carelessness, but at men whose thoughts revealed their intentions toward her. his telepathic access to their plans and their desires creating rage that made him offer to go back and deal with them in ways that his tone suggested would be lethal. The theory emerges that Edward heard their thoughts plotting assault and heard their mental images of what they intended to do, creating visceral fury that combined protective instinct with his own predatory nature. His desire to kill them being partly about protecting Bella, but being partly about satisfying vampire urge to destroy threats through methods that his vegetarian lifestyle normally prevented him from employing. His control during drive away from her attackers was tested not by her scent, but by his rage that made violence appealing, independent of thirst. His hands gripping steering wheel with enough force that wood creaked, demonstrating how close he was to losing control over his anger, rather than losing control over his thirst. Bella's presence in enclosed space of his car created renewed exposure to her scent that his recent hunting and his adrenaline from rescue situation helped him manage. But theory suggests that moments in car represented some of the most difficult control challenges he faced when her scent combined with his emotional state created perfect storm of triggers that his century of discipline barely allowed him to withstand. The meadow revelation, where Edward showed Bella his sparkling skin in sunlight, represented calculated risk and represented ultimate test of whether their relationship could survive truth about his nature. His decision to reveal himself completely rather than maintaining partial deception, showing his assessment that full honesty was necessary foundation for relationship that he wanted to pursue, despite danger and despite certainty that loving her was selfish choice, that prioritized his desires over her safety, his demonstration of his speed and his demonstration of his strength, were designed partly to frighten her into recognizing danger that relationship with him represented, and partly to satisfy his need for her to see him as he truly was, rather than seeing carefully controlled facade that he maintained around humans. His confession about watching her sleep should have ended any possibility of relationship when admission of such profound violation would cause any rational person to recognize Edward as dangerous obsessive whose behavior crossed every boundary that normal relationships respect. But Bella's acceptance of his stalking and her romanticization of his surveillance as evidence of love rather than evidence of predatory fixation enabled continuation of relationship that healthy assessment would have immediately terminated. The theory emerges that Edward was testing her boundaries and testing her judgment through revealing progressively more disturbing aspects of his behavior, his expectation being that she would eventually recognize danger and would leave him, but her continued acceptance. Despite each revelation, creating situation where his worst behaviors receive validation rather than receiving appropriate rejection. His description of her scent as his personal brand of heroin provided explanation for initial hostile reaction, while simultaneously revealing that every moment together required active resistance to addiction that called to him continuously. His honesty about ongoing struggle, creating transparency about danger, while perhaps underestimating how much responsibility such confession placed on Bella to manage his control through monitoring her own behavior in ways that no human should need to consider. The theory suggests Edward's various confessions about his nature and his struggles and his surveillance served dual purpose of satisfying his need for honesty, while simultaneously transferring responsibility for relationship success onto Bella, whose acceptance of danger and whose acceptance of his violations became implicit consent for continuation of dynamic that he recognized as problematic, but that he was unwilling to end through removing himself from her life. The constant battle between desire to be near her and desire to kill her, that Edward described as defining their early relationship, created foundation built on danger that made every interaction weighted with significance and made every moment together feel like triumph over his nature. The dramatic intensity of their connection being inseparable from threat that his vampire nature posed to her continued existence. His century of control made relationship possible, where newborn vampire would have had zero capacity for resistance. But possibility was not. Guarantee and control was not certainty, when single moment of weakness or single loss of focus could result in her death. Despite his love, and despite his determination to protect her from himself. Edward's fundamental belief that he is damned creature without soul and without hope of redemption represents core aspect of his identity that shaped every decision and shaped every relationship across his century of vampire existence. His conviction that transformation destroyed whatever spiritual essence made him human, creating self-perception as monster, whose evil nature was inherent, rather than being result of choices or being result of actions that could be judged independently from his vampire state. The origin of this belief combines Carlyle's own religious doubts and combines Edward's Catholic upbringing and combines his rebellion period guilt into comprehensive self-condemnation that no amount of vegetarian living or no amount of good behavior could adequately address when he believed his nature itself, rather than his actions, determined his moral status. Carlyle's influence on Edward's spiritual worldview was significant, despite Carlyle's own uncertainty about vampire souls, and despite Carlyle's hope rather than certainty that redemption remained possible for their kind. His centuries of grappling with theological implications of vampire existence, providing framework that Edward adopted and then adapted into more pessimistic interpretation, where Carlyle's hope became Edward's certainty of damnation. The theory emerges that Edward's telepathy reinforced his negative self-image through constant exposure to human thoughts that revealed selfishness and revealed cruelty and revealed all the darkness that characterized normal human consciousness. His access to unfiltered thoughts teaching him that humans whose souls were supposedly guaranteed were often morally worse than vampires whose souls were supposedly lost. The contradiction creating cynicism about spiritual categories while simultaneously maintaining his belief in his own damnation. His conviction that loving Bella was a selfish act that prioritized his desires over her safety and over her spiritual welfare represented extension of his self-loathing into romantic context. His belief being that relationship with him endangered not just her physical life but endangered her eternal soul through association with creature who was damned and who might somehow contaminate her through proximity or through love. The theory suggests that Edward's guilt about loving Bella was more about his belief that he was spiritually toxic than about practical dangers that his vampire nature posed. His fear being that loving him would damn her regardless of whether he physically harmed her, when his very existence as soulless creature made him unsuitable partner for human whose soul deserved protection. the Victorian moral framework that Edward maintained across centuries since his human death in 1918, created a lens through which he interpreted vampire nature as sin, rather than as simple biological difference. His religious upbringing during era, when damnation and salvation were concrete concepts, rather than abstract theological discussions, making his belief in literal hell and literal loss of soul seem reasonable rather than seeming like outdated superstition. His inability to update his moral reasoning to match more modern perspectives or more secular understandings of ethics represented both his nostalgia for his human era and his resistance to change that characterized many aspects of his personality, despite centuries of existence providing ample opportunity for philosophical evolution. Edward's view of his vampire nature as curse rather than gift separated him from family members like Emmett, who embraced vampire existence, and from family members like Alice, who felt no regret about transformation. His particular combination of telepathy and self-awareness and guilt, creating uniquely tortured relationship with immortality that others did not share. The theory emerges about whether Edward's self-hatred was actually a sophisticated defense mechanism protecting himself from emotional vulnerability. His conviction that he was monster creating justification for isolation and creating explanation for his century of loneliness that blamed his nature rather than blaming his choices or his standards that no potential partner could meet. His telepathy's role in maintaining his negative self-image can't be overstated, when his constant exposure to others' worst thoughts provided continuous evidence that all consciousness contained darkness and contained selfishness, his own thoughts presumably being no worse than average human thoughts, but his vampire nature making his darkness seem more significant, because it was paired with supernatural power to act on dark impulses. The theory suggests that if Edward could not hear thoughts and could only observe behavior, his assessment of human goodness would be dramatically more positive, and his assessment of his own relative morality would improve through comparison with humans whose internal ugliness remained hidden behind socially acceptable external behavior. His rebellion period guilt, feeding into comprehensive self-loathing, created situation where 4 years of hunting criminals became evidence of his irredeemable nature rather than being understood as mistake or being understood as experimental phase that he ultimately rejected. His inability to forgive himself for killing humans, despite those humans being murderers, suggesting that his standards for his own behavior were impossibly high, while his standards for others were more forgiving. The specific criminals he killed during rebellion presumably deserved legal punishment and presumably had caused suffering to their victims. But Edward's retrospective condemnation of his own actions ignored context and ignored his justifications at the time in favor of absolute judgment that he was murderer regardless of his victim's guilt. The psychological weight of those 4 years between 1927 and 1931 continued crushing Edward decades after his return to vegetarian lifestyle. His memory of entering minds of dying victims and his memory of their final thoughts creating trauma that he never fully processed or never fully released through forgiveness of himself. The theory persists that Edward's guilt was disproportionate to his actual crimes when compared to vampires who had killed thousands of innocent victims across centuries without equivalent remorse. His capacity for guilt, demonstrating his essential goodness, even while his self-assessment concluded opposite interpretation, that his guilt proved his monstrosity. The theory emerges that Edward exaggerates his monstrosity to create distance between himself and Bella, his dramatic self-condemnation serving purpose of pushing her away through convincing her that relationship with him was too dangerous or too morally compromising for her to accept. His constant waiting for her to recognize him as monster, and his constant preparation for her inevitable rejection, suggested that he was testing her, or was perhaps hoping she would end relationship that he wanted but believed he should not have. His self-sabotage through emphasizing his dangerous nature, representing an attempt to force her into making decision that he could not make himself, because his desire for her overwhelmed his conviction that staying away was right choice. His belief that Bella deserved better than vampire boyfriend whose nature made him fundamentally unsuitable for human girl created ongoing tension, where Edward's desires conflicted with his convictions about what was right, his love for her making him want relationship, while his self-loathing made him believe relationship was selfish choice that prioritized his happiness over her welfare. The contradiction between wanting her and wanting her to leave characterized their entire relationship, his internal conflict never fully resolving even after marriage, and even after her transformation, when his reasons for believing she deserved better simply shifted rather than disappearing entirely. The psychology of waiting to be rejected and waiting to be abandoned created self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic, where Edward's assumption that Bella would eventually leave once she truly understood his nature caused behaviors that might actually drive her away. His emotional unavailability and his constant emphasis on danger and his reluctance to fully commit potentially creating very rejection he feared. The theory emerges about whether Edward subconsciously tested Bella's acceptance constantly through revealing progressively more disturbing aspects of his nature or his past. His confessions about watching her sleep, and his confessions about wanting to kill her, and his confessions about his rebellion period serving as trials that would either prove her love was strong enough to withstand truth, or would prove his belief that he was unlovable was correct. His martyr complex manifested in his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness for what he perceived as Bella's good. His decision to leave her after birthday party disaster, representing ultimate expression of his belief that loving him harmed her, and that removing himself from her life was gift, even though his departure nearly destroyed her. The theory suggests that Edward's martyrdom was partly genuine concern for Bella's safety and partly self-punishment for failing to protect her from Jasper's attack. His guilt about birthday incident creating excuse to enact separation that his self-loathing had been suggesting was necessary since beginning of their relationship. The specific details of birthday party attack haunted Edward with particular intensity because incident occurred in his family's home, where Bella should have been safe, and because incident resulted from his family member losing control despite decades of practice, the failure of their supposedly secure environment, and the failure of Jasper's supposedly adequate discipline confirming Edward's deepest fears that vampire nature was fundamentally incompatible with human safety. His response to throw Bella away from Jasper's attack trajectory showed his protective instincts functioning correctly, but his failure to calculate that throwing her into glass table would cause more injury than Jasper's initial lunge might have caused created additional layer of guilt when Edward himself became source of danger that he was trying to prevent. The question of whether Edward would have ever voluntarily transformed Bella without external pressure from Volturi, or without circumstances forcing his hand, remains subject of debate. His adamant refusal to take her soul and his insistence that she experience human life, suggesting he would have delayed indefinitely or would have ultimately refused regardless of her wishes. His belief that transformation was damnation made him incapable of choosing to transform her even when she begged. His love for her manifesting as desire to preserve her humanity and preserve her soul, even at cost of losing her to aging and death that would eventually separate them if she remained human. The birthday party disaster confirmed Edward's worst fears about danger that his family posed to Bella, and confirmed his belief that loving her was selfish choice that endangered her life. Jasper's attack providing concrete evidence that Edward's abstract worries about vampire nature were legitimate concerns, rather than being excessive caution or excessive self-flagellation. His interpretation of birthday incident as proof their relationship was too dangerous ignored context that Bella's paper cut was accident, and ignored fact that Edward himself had thrown her into glass table. His focus on Jasper's loss of control rather than on his own role in escalating situation, revealing how his self-loathing created selective attention that emphasized evidence supporting his negative self-assessment while minimizing contrary evidence. The theory emerges about whether Edward's self-hatred was actually narcissistic focus on his own moral status, rather than being genuine concern for others' welfare. His constant examination of his own worthiness and his constant condemnation of his own nature, creating self-absorption that made his relationships about his guilt, rather than about others' actual needs or others' actual desires. Bella's repeated assertions that she wanted him and wanted vampire life were dismissed as evidence of her poor judgment, rather than being respected as her autonomous choice. His paternalistic belief that he knew better than she did what was good for her, revealing how his Victorian values and his self-loathing combined to justify overriding her agency in name of protection. His conviction that he was monster who would inevitably harm Bella persisted despite century of excellent control and despite vegetarian lifestyle that demonstrated his capability for restraint. His inability to trust himself or trust his track record, suggesting that self-loathing was more about maintaining identity as tortured soul than about realistic assessment of actual danger he posed. The monster complex served psychological function of making his existence seem meaningful through suffering. His pain about his nature creating narrative where he was tragic figure, rather than simply being vampire who had made choice to abstain from human blood, and who had maintained that choice successfully for decades. The comparison between Edward's self-perception and his actual behavior reveals dramatic disconnect when his actions consistently demonstrated control and demonstrated compassion, while his self-assessment remained relentlessly negative. The gap between reality and perception suggesting that his monster complex was psychological construction, rather than being accurate reflection of his character or his capabilities. His family members' perspectives on his nature differed dramatically from his own assessment. Their recognition of his goodness and their trust in his control being based on decades of observation, while his self-condemnation was based on internal standards that no one could meet. and on guilt that he refused to release despite having atoned through returning to vegetarian lifestyle and through maintaining it successfully. Edward's decision-making process leading to his departure from Bella's life after the birthday party disaster involved complex calculus, where his guilt about failing to protect her from Jasper, combined with his long-standing belief that loving her was selfish choice, creating perfect storm of self-recrimination and martyr complex that made leaving seem like only moral option available, despite devastating emotional cost to both of them. His logic was that removing himself from her life would eliminate vampire-related dangers that his presence attracted and would allow her to live normal human existence without supernatural complications that his family had introduced through their relationship. His assumption being that she would recover from heartbreak and would eventually find human boyfriend, whose nature did not threaten her physical safety or threaten her eternal soul through association with damn creature. The theory emerges about whether Alice's visions influenced his choice to leave, when her precognitive gift would have shown futures branching from decision to stay versus decision to leave. Her visions potentially revealing that Bella would survive and would eventually thrive without Edward, even though immediate aftermath would involve suffering. That Alice's gift would have previewed with uncomfortable clarity. Alice's visions during this period remain mysterious in canon, when her perspective on Edward's departure is never fully explored. The question arising whether she supported his decision through seeing positive long-term outcomes, or whether she opposed his decision through seeing Bella's deterioration, but was overruled by Edward's determination to execute plan that he believed was right regardless of short-term pain it would cause. His lies in the forest clearing where he told Bella he did not want her anymore represented calculated cruelty designed to make separation permanent through destroying her hope that he might return if she waited or if she proved herself worthy. His strategy being to make her believe relationship had been mistake rather than being tragic necessity, so that she would move on rather than maintaining attachment that his departure was supposed to sever. The theory suggests that Edward believed his lies would be kinder in long run, even though immediate devastation they caused was obviously cruel. His reasoning being that clean break would heal faster than ambiguous separation that left possibility of reunion, creating ongoing hope that would prevent her from investing in new relationships or new future without him. The specific content of his lies revealed his understanding of what would hurt her most effectively when he claimed she had never belonged in his world, and claimed that he had tired of pretending she was interesting despite her ordinary human nature. His words being designed to attack her self-worth and to make her believe that inadequacy was hers, rather than being his inability to be what she needed. The theory emerges about whether Edward actually believed his lies in moments of speaking them, or whether his delivery of carefully planned speech felt hollow, even as words left his mouth. His century of reading minds making him expert in manipulation, but perhaps making genuine deception of himself impossible, when he knew his own thoughts contradicted every claim he was making to Bella. His promise to make it as though he had never existed represented attempt at mercy that was actually additional cruelty. His intention to remove all traces of his presence, assuming that absence of physical reminders would facilitate healing, when actually his existence had become so central to her identity that erasing evidence could not erase impact, he had made on her consciousness and on her understanding of reality. The theory suggests Edward's plan to erase himself revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how human memory and human attachment function, his vampire nature, and his century of distance from human experience, making him believe that removing objects and removing photos would somehow undo emotional bonds that had formed through months of intimate connection. The family's forced departure from Forks occurred within days of birthday party incident. Their immediate exit from town, where they had lived for 2 years, representing sacrifice that entire family made to support Edward's decision, even though some members disagreed with his choice, and even though leaving meant abandoning carefully constructed lives and carefully constructed identities. The specific location where Cullens relocated during separation months remains ambiguous in canon, the theory suggesting they returned to one of their established properties in different region, or perhaps travelled internationally to create maximum distance between Edward and temptation, to return to Forks, where Bella remained living her life without vampire complications that his presence had introduced. Edward's daily existence during months of separation would have been torture of his own creation, when his telepathy meant he could not distract himself through hearing others' thoughts without being reminded of Bella, whose silent mind had provided unique peace that he had sacrificed through leaving. Every consciousness he encountered being compared unfavorably to void where her thoughts should have been, and being reminder of what he had lost through his martyrdom. The theory emerges about whether Edward attempted to resume his previous activities from before meeting Bella, his return to music composition, or his return to medical studies, providing insufficient distraction when everything reminded him of her, and when his existence had been reorganized around her presence in ways that her absence made painfully obvious through negative space her memory occupied. His hunting during this period may have become mechanical necessity rather than activity he engaged with full attention. His trips into wilderness to feed on animals, providing temporary escape from family members whose thoughts about his decision and whose concerns about his deteriorating state would have been audible to him constantly, despite their attempts to give him privacy or give him space to process his choice. The theory suggests that Edward may have hunted more frequently than necessary, simply to escape family's mental commentary. His isolation in forest, while tracking prey being only time when distance from other consciousness provided genuine solitude that his telepathy normally prevented him from experiencing in proximity to thinking beings. His complete isolation from his family's thoughts about his decision would have been impossible given his telepathy, their concerns and their doubts and their criticisms of his choice being broadcast continuously in his awareness, regardless of whether they spoke aloud. Alice's visions showing Bella's deterioration and Rosalie's satisfaction at separation, and Esme's worry about Edward's emotional state, all creating mental cacophony that he could not escape except through physical distance. The theory emerges about whether Edward avoided his family during separation months, through spending time alone or through traveling separately, his need to escape their thoughts about his decision potentially outweighing his desire for their company, when their mental commentary on his suffering and on Bella's suffering would have been constant reminder of consequences his choice was creating. Rosalie's phone call to Edward reporting Bella's death, based on Alice's vision and based on Jacob's deliberately misleading confirmation, when he answered phone at Bella's house represented culmination of miscommunication and misfortune that transformed Edward's suffering during separation into immediate crisis requiring action. Her motivation for calling remains subject to theoretical debate when canon provides limited insight into whether Rosalie acted from genuine concern for Edward despite her approval of separation, or whether her call represented malicious satisfaction at confirming that Bella was gone permanently. Her complex feelings about Bella and about Edward's relationship creating ambiguity about whether information she provided was meant as kindness or as cruelty, disguised as family obligation to inform him of significant event. The theory suggests Rosalie may have genuinely believed she was providing important information that Edward deserved to know, despite their disagreements about his relationship with Bella, her own experiences with loss, and her own capacity for grief, making her recognize that learning of Bella's death from stranger, or learning of it much later, would be worse than hearing news immediately from family member, even if that news caused pain. The alternative theory suggests darker motivation, where Rosalie's resentment of Bella and satisfaction at Edward's return to family without human complications made her eager to confirm that obstacle to his full reintegration had been eliminated through Bella's death, her call being calculated to ensure Edward knew that returning to Forks was no longer option, because girl who had disrupted their existence was gone. Edward's interpretation of news that Bella had died represented catastrophic failure of his entire martyrdom project, when his departure had been justified as protecting her life and protecting her future. Her death, mere months after his exit, making his sacrifice meaningless and making his suffering pointless, when goal of keeping her safe had failed spectacularly. His immediate response reveals his fundamental attachment to her, despite months of separation, and despite his attempts to convince himself that leaving was right choice. His reaction being not relief that temptation was eliminated, but rather despair so complete that his own continued existence seemed unbearable when immortality without her stretched endlessly ahead, containing nothing but memory of his failure to protect her, and memory of his last cruel words that would be final communication between them. The decision to seek death from Volturi rather than through other means represented Edward's particular psychology and represented his need for execution that would be definitive and would be witnessed, rather than being ambiguous death through provoking fight, or being private death through walking into sunlight where no one would observe his end. The theory emerges about why Volturi execution specifically appealed to Edward when simpler methods existed, his choice suggesting that he wanted death that was official and was sanctioned rather than being suicide that might be interpreted as weakness or might be interpreted as mental illness rather than being understood as rational response to unbearable loss. His plan to expose himself at noon during St. Marcos Day festival in Volterra demonstrated tactical intelligence applied to suicide mission, his understanding of Volturi operations, and his understanding of their enforcement mechanisms, allowing him to create situation where his death would be mandatory rather than being negotiable when public exposure of vampire nature would threaten entire vampire civilization secrecy. The theory suggests Edward chose most public and most undeniable method of forcing Volturi response, because he wanted certainty, rather than risking that Volturi might refuse his request for death. if he simply asked, or if he violated laws in ways that were ambiguous enough to permit mercy. The specific timing to coincide with festival's noon bells and with maximum crowd density showed his commitment to ensuring success of suicide plan. His preparation including reconnaissance of Volterra's layout and calculation of optimal location for exposure, creating military precision in service of self-destruction, that his century of existence and his supernatural capabilities made tragically effective. His choice of red-robed festival celebrating St. Marcus created ironic context where humans celebrated vampire's death, while actual vampire prepared for his own death, the symbolism being lost on human celebrants, but being obvious to Edward, whose appreciation for literary irony persisted even during planning of his suicide. The theory persists about how long Edward had been planning this specific method before actually attempting execution. The question arising whether he had researched Volturi protocols and Italian festivals during previous years as contingency planning for circumstances that might make death preferable to continued existence, or whether his planning occurred entirely during travel to Italy after receiving news of Bella's death. His knowledge of Volterra and his knowledge of St. Marcus Day suggests either previous research or remarkably quick intelligence gathering during crisis, when his emotional state should have prevented careful tactical planning, but when his century of discipline and his supernatural capabilities allowed him to function despite devastation. His state of mind during travel to Italy represented complete disconnection from will to exist, combined with absolute clarity about his goal. His emotional death having already occurred when he believed Bella was dead, making his physical death seem like a formality, or seem like completion of process that her loss had initiated. The theory emerges about whether Edward felt relief during planning of his death through anticipating end of suffering, that immortality would otherwise make permanent, his century of existence having taught him that vampire memory did not fade, and that emotional pain did not diminish across decades when supernatural consciousness maintained experiences with clarity that human memory gradually softened through biological forgetting mechanisms that vampires lacked. Alice's vision of Edward's plan materialized while she stood in Bella's living room after cliff diving rescue. Her sudden awareness that Edward was traveling to Italy to seek death from Volturi, creating immediate crisis that required intervention despite her inability to see Bella's futures during werewolf period, having prevented her from knowing that Bella was alive until that moment. The theory suggests Alice's visions of Edward had been showing his increasing despair during separation months, but had not shown specific suicide plan until decision was made and action was initiated. Her precognition working on decision-based futures, meaning that Edward's final choice to execute plan rather than continuing to exist in suffering created sudden vision that allowed intervention. The moment Alice's vision reached Edward through phone call, or through Alice's attempts to contact him, remains unclear in canon. The theory suggesting that he may have been unreachable during final approach to Volterra, or may have dismissed her messages as attempts to prevent action he had already committed to completing. His determination to die combined with his expectation that Alice would try to stop him created situation where he might have deliberately avoided contact with family during final hours, his need to complete suicide mission overriding any remaining attachment to family members whose love for him was insufficient motivation to continue existing without Bella. Edward's transformation of Bella after Renesmee's catastrophic birth represented psychological test that exceeded anything his century of vampire existence had prepared him for. His performance of emergency cesarean using his teeth rather than surgical instruments, and his subsequent injection of venom directly into her failing heart, requiring him to taste her blood while simultaneously maintaining enough control to stop before draining her completely, when every instinct was demanding he continue drinking. The theory emerges about what Edward was experiencing internally during those crucial minutes when he was biting her wrists and her ankles and her throat to spread venom throughout her system, while her blood was in his mouth, creating fulfillment of desire he had been resisting since their first biology class together. His century of discipline being tested beyond what any vampire should be capable of withstanding when the singer blood that had called to him for over a year was finally accessible without restriction. His methodical coverage of bite locations across her body demonstrated medical knowledge overriding predatory instinct. His understanding that venom needed to reach all extremities before her circulation stopped, completely making systematic approach necessary despite psychological torture of tasting her blood repeatedly while forcing himself to release her and move to next location rather than feeding until she was drained. The theory suggests that Carlisle's presence and Carlisle's voice providing guidance helped anchor Edward's consciousness to purpose of saving Bella, rather than allowing him to become lost in feeding frenzy that newborn vampire or less disciplined vampire would have succumbed to under equivalent circumstances. His trust in Carlisle and his desire to honor that trust providing additional motivation beyond his own love for Bella to maintain control that seemed superhuman, even by vampire standards. The mechanics of what Edward experienced while sucking venom from Bella's wrist after James's bite in the ballet studio provided preview of the psychological torture that her transformation would later require. His first taste of her blood during that extraction, creating battle between his desire to continue drinking and his determination to save her life that nearly destroyed his control despite Carlisle's presence and despite Alice's hand on his shoulder, anchoring him to reality. The theory emerges that this earlier experience of tasting her blood and successfully stopping prepared him for the even more difficult challenge of transforming her after Renesmee's birth. His knowledge that he had succeeded once before providing confidence that he could succeed again, even when circumstances were more desperate, and when the amount of blood he tasted was greater, and when his access to her blood was less restricted by need to extract venom versus need to spread venom throughout her dying body. His relationship with Jacob after imprint occurred created strange dynamic where Werewolf, who had loved Bella romantically, was now devoted to Bella's daughter through supernatural bonding that made Jacob family member, despite history of rivalry and despite ongoing treaty tensions between vampires and shapeshifters. The theory emerges about whether Edward resents Jacob's imprint on Renesmee, or whether he feels relieved that Jacob's romantic interest in Bella has been permanently redirected toward protecting Renesmee, whose safety becomes Jacob's primary purpose through imprint bond that supersedes all other loyalties, including his pack obligations. Edward's telepathic access to Jacob's thoughts about Renesmee provides uncomfortable awareness of exactly how Jacob's feelings have transformed and provides preview of their future relationship. that Edward must accept despite any discomfort when Jacob's imprint makes him permanent fixture in Renesmee's life. The complexity of Edward's feelings about Jacob's constant presence in their lives cannot be understated when his previous jealousy and his previous resentment of Jacob's ability to offer Bella warmth and normalcy that vampire relationship could never provide has transformed into gratitude mixed with residual discomfort about Jacob's eternal bond to their daughter. The theory suggests that Edward's telepathy makes accepting Jacob easier in some ways because he can verify that Jacob's intentions toward Renesmee are genuinely protective and genuinely devoted without ulterior motives or without inappropriate elements, despite imprint bond's potential to evolve into romantic connection when Renesmee reaches maturity. His ability to hear Jacob's thoughts, providing reassurance that Jacob's current role is guardian, rather than being predatory interest in child, who is currently infant. Edward, as father, represents role he never anticipated occupying when vampire reproduction was considered impossible, and when his relationship with Bella was supposed to remain childless across eternity. His sudden parenthood requiring adjustment to responsibilities and requiring adjustment to fears that his own childhood and his own transformation provide inadequate preparation for navigating. His telepathic ability to hear Renesmee's thoughts, unlike Bella's, creates parenting advantage and creates parenting complication when his daughter's consciousness is completely accessible to him in ways that normal parent-child relationship would never provide. His knowledge of her every thought and her every feeling making privacy impossible for her, while making deception impossible when she cannot hide anything from father who hears her mind constantly. The theory persists about whether Edward's ability to hear Renesmee's thoughts will damage their relationship as she matures and as she desires privacy that normal adolescents expect, but that she cannot achieve when her father's telepathy provides him complete access to her consciousness. His experience of hearing everyone's thoughts throughout his vampire existence has taught him about the gap between public presentation and private consciousness. His parenting of Renesmee potentially being complicated by his knowledge of her every doubt and her every fear and her every criticism of his decisions, when normal parents can maintain illusion that their children's compliance indicates agreement rather than simply indicating obedience that masks disagreement. The theory emerges about what Edward's relationship with immortality has become now that he has Bella as vampire beside him and has Renesmee as hybrid daughter, whose existence gives their eternity purpose beyond simple existence. His century of viewing vampire nature as curse potentially shifting towards acceptance or toward appreciation when immortality shared with Bella seems like gift rather than seeming like damnation. His previous despair about eternal existence was tied partly to his loneliness and partly to his belief that vampire nature was inherently evil. Bella's presence as vampire who chose transformation willingly and who embraces her new existence potentially challenging his negative assessment of what they are and what their immortality means. The question of whether Edward still believes he is damned now that Bella shares his vampire state remains unresolved. The theory suggesting that his religious concerns about souls and about damnation might have shifted when watching Bella's transformation and watching her maintain her essential goodness despite becoming vampire whose nature he'd believed was incompatible with spiritual salvation. His century of self-condemnation may have been challenged by Bella's experience as newborn, whose control exceeded all expectations and whose moral character remained intact, despite transformation that Edward believed destroyed souls. Her existence as proof that vampire nature does not automatically corrupt, creating potential for Edward to reconsider his beliefs about his own spiritual status. His relationship with Bella as equals rather than as protector and protected represents fundamental shift in dynamic that had characterized their relationship since first meeting, her vampire strength making her his physical equal, and her superior newborn control making her more capable in some contexts than he is despite his century of experience. The theory emerges about whether this equality challenges Edward's identity as protector, whose purpose was keeping Bella safe. Her capability to protect herself and even to protect him through her shield, potentially requiring him to reconsider his role and reconsider his value when he is no longer necessary for her survival in ways that his protection was necessary during her human years. Edward's response to Bella's superior self-control as newborn created a complex mixture of pride and confusion when her immediate rationality and her immediate ability to resist human blood exceeded what his own newborn year had involved, and exceeded what any vampire in his experience had demonstrated immediately after transformation. The theory suggests that her superior control might challenge his assumptions about vampire nature and might challenge his understanding of what newborn period requires. Her capability suggesting that control is more achievable than he believed, and suggesting that his own struggles were perhaps not inevitable aspects of vampire nature, but were rather individual responses that varied more dramatically than he had assumed, based on his limited sample size of observing family members' newborn periods, and based on his own experience that may not have been representative of typical newborn experience. The future of Edward's musical compositions represents continuation of creative outlet that has sustained him across century of existence, his piano playing and his composing having evolved from human talent into supernatural capability that allows complexity and allows emotional expression that his verbal communication sometimes cannot adequately convey. The theory emerges about what other creative pursuits Edward might explore with Bella across their shared eternity, when his previous existence was limited by loneliness and was limited by his martyrdom complex that made enjoying immortality seem inappropriate. Her presence potentially liberating him to pursue interests and pursue experiences that his self-loathing had previously prevented him from fully embracing. His composition of Bella's lullaby during early months of their relationship demonstrated how music serves as emotional outlet for feelings he struggles to articulate verbally. The piece expressing his love and his anguish and his commitment in ways that words could not capture adequately, when the complexity of his feelings exceeded what language could convey. The theory suggests that Edward will continue composing music that documents their life together and documents their family's evolution. His future compositions potentially including pieces for Esme and pieces that celebrate his transformation from lonely vampire to fulfilled husband and father, whose existence finally matches his Victorian ideals about love and about family, that his century of isolation had made him believe were permanently out of reach. Edward's relationship with Charlie, after Charlie gains limited awareness of supernatural elements in his daughter's life, creates ongoing tension where Edward must maintain careful deception while allowing enough truth that Charlie can continue having a relationship with Bella and with Renesmee. The theory suggests that Edward's telepathy makes these interactions particularly challenging when he hears Charlie's thoughts and hears Charlie's suspicions, and must carefully manage his responses to avoid confirming details that need to remain secret, while avoiding lies that his telepathy tells him Charlie would detect through inconsistencies or through his law enforcement training that makes him observant of deception. The long-term implications of Volturi interest in their family represents ongoing threat that Edward's telepathy and Edward's strategic thinking make him particularly qualified to navigate. His century of understanding vampire politics and his understanding of Aro's personality and Aro's goals, providing framework for anticipating future confrontations and for preparing defenses against potential Volturi actions. The theory emerges about whether Aro will ever stop attempting to recruit Alice and Edward and Bella, whose gifts represent capabilities that Volturi Guard lacks. His desire to acquire talented vampires being a consistent character trait that spans millennia, and that their successful resistance during Renesmee confrontation likely intensified rather than satisfied when demonstration of their combined capabilities made them even more desirable as potential Guard members. Edward's immortal future, witnessing humanity's evolution across centuries and across millennia, represents continuation of existence that previously seemed unbearable, but that now includes Bella, whose presence transforms endless time from curse into possibility. The theory suggests that his Victorian values and his 19th century moral framework will gradually erode or will gradually adapt through exposure to changing human culture and through Bella's influence, representing more contemporary perspectives. His resistance to change that characterized his first century potentially softening when he has reason to engage with the evolving world, rather than remaining frozen in attitudes from his human era that increasingly seem outdated as decades pass and as cultural standards continue shifting away from values he absorbed during his mortal life. The question of whether Edward and Bella will ever face another separation creates anxiety that his experience of months apart and his experience of nearly dying from grief makes particularly acute. His understanding that immortality contains infinite time for potential disasters or potential circumstances that might separate them, creating ongoing vulnerability despite their commitment and despite their bond. The theory emerges that Edward's fear of losing Bella may never fully disappear regardless of her vampire invulnerability, when his psychological trauma from their separation and from believing she had died created permanent sensitivity to possibility of loss that his telepathy cannot protect against and that his supernatural abilities cannot prevent if circumstances align against them. Edward's ultimate character arc from self-loathing vampire who believed he was damned to husband and father, who has found purpose and has found acceptance, represents journey that his reunion with Bella initiated and that Renesmee's birth completed, his transformation being psychological rather than physical, when his vampire nature remained constant while his understanding of what that nature meant evolved through love and through family and through experiences that challenged his certainty about his own monstrosity. The theory persists about whether Edward has fully overcome his self-hatred, or whether residual guilt and residual doubt about his worthiness continue influencing his thoughts and his behaviors in subtle ways that Bella's acceptance cannot entirely eliminate, when century of self-condemnation cannot be erased through years of evidence contradicting his negative self-assessment. The unanswered question that haunts analysis of Edward's character is whether he finally believes he deserves happiness that he has found with Bella and with Renesmee, and with family whose acceptance he has always had, but whose love he struggled to accept, when his self-perception as monster made their affections seem misguided or seem based on incomplete understanding of his true nature. And so, Edward's journey from lonely vampire who believed he was damned creature without hope of redemption to husband and father who has found purpose transforms across century of existence, where his telepathic gift was simultaneously blessing that connected him to all consciousness and curse that prevented him from finding peace, until Bella's silent mind provided refuge from constant mental noise that had defined his vampire life. The mysteries explored tonight reveal depths beyond surface story. His century of waiting for someone whose mind he could not hear, creating foundation for love that transcended his self-loathing and transcended his certainty that he was monster undeserving of happiness or undeserving of redemption, that Bella's acceptance offered despite all evidence he provided about his dangerous nature. His transformation from believing he was soulless predator to accepting that love and family and choice define character more than nature defines destiny represents ongoing journey rather than completed arc. His struggles with worthiness and his struggles with deserving happiness likely continuing across immortal future, even as Bella's presence beside him and Renesmee's existence as their daughter provide daily evidence contradicting his century of self-condemnation. The theories remain theories and the questions remain unanswered, because that is nature of complex character, whose internal life exceeds what canon fully explores. The gaps inviting speculation and inviting interpretation that makes Edward's story endlessly fascinating, across multiple readings and across endless midnight contemplation. Rest now, carried by mysteries of his midnight sun, and carried by theories that illuminate shadows in his century of existence. May you find peace in unanswered questions and comfort in complexity that defies simple resolution. Sleep well with visions of Edward's perspective, Twilight Souls. Good night.